And welcome back to Huge Deck Building. I'm your host, Demo, and this is 10 cards you should be putting in your Commander decks, episode 14. Starting off this week with Thran Turbine. 1 mana artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may add 2 colorless. You can't spend this mana to cast spells. So this is another card that, again, when there was mana burn, it wasn't nearly as good, right? Because if you didn't use the mana, you would get mana burn from it, right? For anyone who doesn't know, mana burn is you have to use your mana. If it empties out of your pool, it does you that amount of damage, right? So obviously that's not a thing anymore. So there is 0 downside to this card. And it's just, it's great in any deck where you have a mana sink, a Thrasios, for example. I mean, I know you're probably doing lots of busted stuff in a Thrasios deck anyway, but it is 2 colorless mana that you can use for your Thrasios. It's 2 colorless mana that you can use for your Locust God. I put this in my Sfella deck because that is a commander that has an ability that can use that colorless mana. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can use this, but if you have any commander that has a ability where you want to be using colorless mana on it all the time, this is just free mana every turn, right? You could also put this in, say, a Zerda deck, because Zerda decks tend to have lots of those activated abilities where you need colorless mana. So, I mean, it's just free mana every turn, right? So there's always options for stuff like that. Next up today, Time and Tide, and this is a really unusual one. I've talked about phasing quite a bit because phasing is a very powerful ability in Commander. This is very niche, very specific. Yes, I know. So blue, instant. Simultaneously, all phased out creatures phase in, and all creatures with phasing phase out. So all the creatures that have phasing are going to phase out. That's probably not going to do anything, right? I mean, unless you're playing creatures with phasing, that could be something. It could do something. There is the reason I'm talking about this card is because this is the anti-phasing card, right? This is what is going to, all your opponents that are playing those spells that I've been talking about, like Reality Ripple, that protect your stuff, this is going to counter that effect. And I know people will say, why not just play Counterspell, right? Because that'll do it. Sure. Again, though, there can be advantages to not just filling your deck full of counterspells. I'm mentioning this card for one specific reason, though. All those guys out there who are playing Teferi's Protection, and I'm one of them. I love that card. I have it in pretty much all my white decks. This is the anti-Teferi's Protection card, right? So, there's always those moments where someone casts a board wipe and, the guy in your playgroup goes, aha, Teferi's Protection, and he's acting all smug. You can respond, cast this, and all of his creatures that just phased out will now phase in, right? They don't have phasing, but they are phased out creatures, right? It's just sort of a really fun gotcha card. If you have a guy who's in your play group who puts Teferi's Protection in all of his decks and he just loves casting it to protect his creatures from board wipes, this is a sort of a fun way to go, actually, all your creatures are now going to phase back in and they're going to die to that board wipe, so. Next up, Titania's Song, 4 mana enchantment. Each non-creature artifact loses all abilities and becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost. If Titania's Song leaves the battlefield, this effect continues until end of turn. So, very powerful effect, right? This is going to turn all those mana rocks into artifact creatures. So this does 2 things. The first thing it does is it turns your opponents, or yours too, but mostly you're going to use this on your opponents, right? It turns your opponents' non-creature artifacts into creatures. So now they can die to removal, right? So you can play this and then cast a Wrath of God, and this becomes destroy all your opponent's artifacts, right? Also, what it does is it turns them off, right? Because they lose all abilities. So if your opponent has a mana rock, that's an ability, right? Their Soul Ring, tap to add 2 colorless mana, that's an ability. It now loses that ability, right? Their Soul Ring now becomes a 1/1 colorless artifact creature, essentially, right? Their Mana Crypts, again, if you're in a play group where your buddies like to play lots of those 0 mana artifacts, they all just die because they become 0/0 artifact creatures and instantly die. There's just a lot of ways to use this, right? It shuts down artifact decks pretty hard. Coming in at number 4, Together Forever, white enchantment. When Together Forever enters the battlefield, support 2, right? Which means put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures, right? They don't have to be yours, so that does matter. Pay 1, choose target creature with a counter on it. When that creature dies this turn, return that card to its owner's hand. So I'm mentioning this card. This is a new card, right? This card everyone I'm sure has seen before, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because I just put this in 2 decks, okay? This card just got a hell of a lot better because when this card was first made, it's like, okay, white doesn't really do +1/+1 counters. So that what kind of decks does this go in? It goes in an Elenda deck. That's the deck that as soon as I saw it, I'm like, okay, that goes in an Elenda deck for sure. I had an Elenda deck at the time. If you don't have this in your Elenda deck already, put it in there. It's an auto-included Elenda deck, I think. However, with all these new cards from Strixhaven, there's a whole bunch. And they started doing this in Commander Legends with the white +1/+1 counters. There's a lot of white and black, our Orzhov +1/+1 counters deck. There's a whole bunch more with Strixhaven and Commander 2021. This card is going to start going in a lot of decks. I mean, I don't know if you want to run out there and buy a couple copies because the price isn't going to increase, but there's a whole bunch of decks in white, particularly, that now care about counters. And keep in mind, the bottom part is choose target creature with a counter on it. Doesn't have to be a +1/+1 counter, right? Coming in at number 5, Tombstone Stairwell. 2 black, 4 mana, world enchantment, right? And as I was notified in one of my videos, on another one of my videos, because I think I was talking about Koskin Falls, which is also a world enchantment. World enchantments, there can only be 1 in existence at a time. Basically how Legendary used to work, for anyone who doesn't know, Legendary, the way it used to work is if you had an Elishnorn and your opponent played an Elishnorn, yours would die, but they got rid of that because they thought it was too easy to get rid of your opponent's Legendary creature. World enchantments do work like that, though. There can only be 1 Tombstone Stairwell on the battlefield at a time. In fact, there can only be 1 world enchantment, period. I'll actually read the ruling here. This has the super type world. When a world permanent enters the battlefield, any world permanents that were already on the battlefield are put in owner's graveyard. And again, I like that. I think that's interesting. It's just a neat little interesting interaction there. It's not going to come up much. I just think it's kind of neat. Anyway, the actual card, it has cumulative upkeep, 1 and a black. So, that's not great. Cumulative upkeep's not great. However, it has a really powerful ability. At the beginning of each upkeep, okay, so on each player's upkeep, if Tombstone Stairwell is on the battlefield, kind of weird wording there, but I'm sure there's a reason why they did that wording that way. I'm not sure why it wouldn't be on the battlefield. But anyway, each player creates a 2/2 black zombie creature token with haste named Tombspawn for each creature card in their graveyard. At the beginning of each end step, or when Tombstone Stairwell leaves the battlefield, destroy all tokens created with Tombstone Stairwell. So there's a lot of things to say here. First of all, at the beginning of each upkeep, as we know in Commander, because you have 4 players, that is really significant because it's happening all the time. Each player is going to create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with haste named Tombspawn for each creature card in the graveyard. So already, if you have a zombie deck, this can be advantage you. You have to be careful here, right? You're giving tokens to your opponents that they can use to attack you with, that they can use to sacrifice. If you're playing a deck where you want to be sacrificing creatures all the time, this is fantastic because on each player's upkeep, you're going to be getting all these tokens into play that you can then sacrifice, right? I think the best way to use this, though, again, the important wording here is you destroy all these tokens, right, at the beginning of each end step. So they come into play, and then at the end step, you destroy them. So again, and I'll bring up Elenda, great in an Elenda deck because there are so many creatures dying all the time, right? You think about it, you play this on your opponent's upkeep, the next opponent. Let's just say each player has 2 creatures in their graveyard. That's 8 zombie creatures being created, and they're all going to die at the beginning of the next end step. So that's 8 counters you're going to be putting on your Elenda just on one player's turn. By the time it gets back around to your turn, your Elenda is going to be a 20/20 or something, right? So any deck where you want creatures to be dying all the time, Tombstone Stairwell can be really, really good in. Next up, Tortured Existence. 1 black mana, enchantment, pay 1 black mana, discard a creature card, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. You can use this in 2 ways. You can use this in, I want certain cards of mine to be in my graveyard, right? Then there's lots of creatures that you want in your graveyard, like an Anger or a Carrionet, right? Something like that. So it can be great for putting cards into your graveyard, your creature cards in your graveyard that you want there. And obviously you can use it to get creature cards out of your graveyard, right? We've all been in a place place late in the game where you have a creature card in your graveyard that you really want, and you have one in your hand that's useless to you, like a Wood Elves, because you don't need ramp, so you want to discard it to get something out of your graveyard that you really want. Also, this card combos. If you haven't already heard, this is an auto-include in a Tormod deck. Okay, I actually came across this combo accidentally with Desecrated Tomb, which is essentially the same sort of effect as Tormod. I had it in my Adun Oakenshield deck where I wanted to be taking creatures in and out of my graveyard lots. So it was a great fit. And because I was doing that, I put Desecrated Tomb in there. And yeah, I just noticed, hey, on my opponent's end step, I'm like, okay, I want to get a creature card out of my graveyard. I got that certain creature out, discarded one, and get a bat token. I'm like, oh. And then I realized I could just keep swapping them back and forth. For every 1 black mana I had, and I happen to have an Urborg in play, I could create a bat token, and I could just keep swapping back and forth and swapping back and forth, right? With Tormod, it works even better, right? You get a 2/2 zombie. For every 1 black mana, you're going to swap creatures back and forth, and you're going to create a 2/2 zombie token. And of course, they come into play tap, but this is, you can do this in instant speed. So you do it on your opponent's end step, create a whole ton of zombie tokens, and then they untap and they're ready to go on your turn. Next up, Total War, 4 mana enchantment. Whenever a player attacks with 1 or more creatures, right? So this is everybody, including you. Destroy all untapped non-wall creatures that player controls that didn't attack. Although it's except for creatures that player hasn't controlled continuously since the beginning of the turn. So creatures with summoning sickness, right? I don't know if anyone uses that term anymore, but creatures with summoning sickness, creatures they've just played, don't get destroyed. So this is, again, there's a lot of ways you can use this card. This can be like a War's Toll type effect. So if you have a deck that has a card like War's Toll, right? That second ability, if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attack. So if you want to be doing stuff like that, this is another option for you. They don't have to attack with those creatures, but then they're going to get destroyed if they don't, right? So either way, that's win-win for you. So if you want your opponent's creatures to be attacking, maybe in a Thantis, the Warweaver type of deck, a deck like that. Obviously, if your commander's in play, all creatures have to attack each combat of Fable, but you always want backups for that, right? If your commander gets killed, then what does your deck do? The deck doesn't do anything. So you always want backup effects for stuff like that. Also, though, I think a really interesting way to play this card, because it destroys creatures, right? And that, I think, is the important wording there. I was thinking an interesting way to use this is in maybe a Boros Equipment and Aura deck. And there's lots of those out there. I had made a Titania Ship's Caretaker deck briefly. And I thought, rather than going the typical Voltron strategy with Aura and Equipment, why don't I go the pacifism, or prison term strategy where all I'm doing is just putting those auras on my opponent's creatures so they can't attack with them. So in a deck like that, what you're going to do is you're going to put that pacifism effect on your opponent's creature, and then basically that makes it so that your opponent can't attack you at all. I mean, they can attack you, but then that creature with pacifism is going to get destroyed because it is a creature. It's not going to be attacking. It's not going to have summoning sickness. It can't attack because of the pacifism. So basically, if they attack, it just ends up destroying their own creature, right? Coming in at number 8, Tradewind Rider. And this is a personal favorite of mine again. More nostalgia for me. 3 and a blue, creature spirit. So that's important that it's a spirit, I think. A lot of spirit decks could probably fit this card. It's a 1/4 flyer. Tap. And you tap 2 untapped creatures you control, return target permanent to owner's hand. It's just a really great card because it can bounce any permanent. And there are lots of decks out there that want to be tapping your creatures too. So that is important to note. Again, spirits, I think, this can go in a lot of spirit decks. There's a lot of decks where you're making spirit tokens. It goes in a lot of decks where you're just kind of sitting back, pillow fort type of decks. You could maybe put this in a Phoenix deck. I'm thinking of the Phoenix deck that I made. And this, because you're sitting there on defense all the time with all your creatures untapped, you could have this in that deck. Just a lot of ways to use it. Really great old card. Coming in at number 9, Tranquil Grove. 2 mana enchantment, 1 and a green. Pay 1 green, destroy all other enchantments. If you have a guy in your play group with an enchantment tribal deck, man, this is just going to screw him, isn't it? This destroys all other enchantments. So Tranquil Grove is just going to sit there. Basically, what's going to happen is your opponents are just not going to play enchantments, right? It's very similar to Aura Shards that way. Aura Shards is artifacts and enchantments, but basically, I see Aura Shards almost as a stacks card because when someone plays it, it basically becomes, okay, I just can't play artifacts and enchantments, right? That's basically, Aura Shards is your opponents can't play artifacts and enchantments because you know they're going to get destroyed right away. So why would you bother playing them, right? Tranquil Grove sort of will become the same thing, right? You play it, you'll destroy all your opponent's enchantments, which is good. I mean, it destroys yours too, but probably you're not going to play a lot of enchantments if you have this in your deck. And then it's just going to sit there. After you've destroyed all enchantments, it just sits there and your opponents are going to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to play my Rhystic Study now because it's just going to get destroyed, right? So it just prevents your opponents from playing their enchantments. It can be a really powerful effect. And lastly today, Tower of the Magistrate. And when I made my 30 colorless utility lands list, a guy commented on the video, hey, where's Tower of the Magistrate? And I was like, what the hell is that? You know, never heard of it. Looked it up and I was like, okay, tap to add 1 colorless mana. Pay 1, tap, target creature gains protection from artifacts till end of turn. And I responded to the guy and I said, are you thinking of something else? Because that card's really bad. You know, I thought maybe he was trolling me. And then someone else mentioned it. I had another guy, a guy actually that frequents, you know, is a regular viewer. And he said, hey, no Tower of the Magistrate, what's going on? I'm like, am I missing something here? And I talked to one of the guys and he actually gave me a pretty decent rundown of why this card is really good. And I hadn't actually thought of it. So I'll give a shout out to him. His name's Aaron Marks. Okay. And what he said is your first thought may be to give your blockers protection from an attacking artifact creature or vice versa. Very limited case. Yes. I mean, that's what I thought. He refers to the land as Swords Fall Off, right? And what it means is you pay 1 and you give an opponent's creature protection from artifacts until end of turn. Works really good against any sort of a Voltron strategy or equipment slash Voltron strategy, right? Again, this is very niche and very specific. I would not put it in all my decks, but it is good if you have a guy in your play group that has a Voltron deck or any, because they use lots of equipment. If you have someone in your group with one of those Boros or an equipment decks that are just putting equipment on all of their creatures, right? This just becomes, you know, your opponent's creature can't be equipped this turn, essentially, right? If they don't have Shroud, like if they don't have Hexproof and Shroud, you know, he calls it Swords Fall Off. However, it is target creature gains protection. So if they have a Lightning Greaves or something like that, you can't use it. It has to be before that happens, right? You know, they play a creature and they're about to put a Lightning Greaves on it, and you give it protection from artifacts, so it can't be equipped by the Lightning Greaves, and it's until end of turn, so they can't continue to try to do it, right? So it is a very usable, very interesting card, and shout out to that guy for pointing it out. Again, I wouldn't be throwing it in all my decks. I think it works really good in those specific situations, though. So that is it for today. That is 10 more cards that you should be putting in your Commander decks. Thanks for tuning in.